All right, from the Carl Sagan Andrewian Theater at the Center for Inquiry West in Los Angeles. Welcome. This is Feed Your Brain for February 16th, 2025. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jim Underdown, Executive Director here at the Center for Inquiry. I'll be your host for today. Now, this past week, we celebrated two gigantic birthdays. Charles Darwin's birthday was on Wednesday, February 12th. And yesterday was Galileo's birthday. Two giants of science who pushed the needle forward and made some great advancements. Tomorrow is the 425th anniversary of the execution by fire of Giordano Bruno. Some of you know that name. This happened in the Campo di Fiori in Rome, and he was executed because of some crazy ideas he had, namely that the stars in the sky were similar to our own sun and that there may be other planets out there as well. For those wacky ideas, he was burnt alive by the church, and that also sent a chill through the rest of the region for any science-minded person who might have some ideas about contradicting what the church said. So one of those people that might have thrown a scare through was Galileo himself, who not too many years later, 500 meters from the spot where Bruno was killed, would be tried for his own radical ideas. So we never want to forget about people who stand up for science-based ideas like that. So the advancement of science has come a long way in 400 years, but wacky ideas still persist, and that's what brings us here today. The study and understanding of autism has been changing a lot in the last few decades, and unfortunately has had to deal with quite a bit of misunderstanding and misinformation surrounding this disorder. The belief in telepathy is much older. I can see some caveman grunting and his wife saying, "I knew you were going to say that." The conflating of autism and telepathy is part of what we're going to discuss today. And who better to do so than Stuart Vyse? Stuart is a behavioral scientist, teacher, and writer. He has a PhD in psychology and a master's in English. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He taught at Providence College, the University of Rhode Island, and Connecticut College, and he is a contributing editor to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. He writes the Behavior and Belief column every issue for that. He's also the author of 5 books, including Believing in Magic, The Psychology of Superstition. With that, please welcome Stuart Vyse.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. Okay, I'm going to take a glass of sip here. Thank you, Jim. That was great. Can you hear me? Okay, good. It's wonderful to be here. I haven't been in church in a very long time, and as churches go, this one is pretty nice. You know, what can go wrong when it's named after Carl Sagan and Andrewian? I'm going to go very fast. There's a lot of slides here, so buckle up. And if there's anything that you have questions about, I'm happy to answer at the end. So yeah, just to mention something else about my background that's important today, and that is that very early, before I was a psychologist, I did work with children with severe forms of autism, non-speaking individuals who engaged in self-injurious behavior and aggressive behavior and had very limited or no language or speech. I did go back to school and got a PhD, taught for a while, did the usual academic publishing, but I also wrote books, and as you've heard, and superstition for some reason ended up being a main thing. But most recently, since retiring from teaching, I have been writing for Skeptical Inquirer, and I have to say, I love it. It has been a wonderful thing to have this outlet, and you're going to see part of why that's true today, because I'm going to talk about 3 stories that have happened just in the last year, in less than a year, that I've been able to respond to through the magazine or other ways. So,
Stuart,
yes.
Bend that toward your mouth.
Okay. All right. Oh, is that better? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So this is a very simplified. We have a mixed audience here, so some of this will be review. But these are the primary qualifications or criteria for autism as described by the American Psychiatric Association in their diagnostic manual. And so deficits in social communication, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, and that it presents itself in early development, and it's a significant impairment of some kind, not explainable by something else. So that's the basic idea, and it's been thought of quite differently over the years. There's a real development, and this diagram sort of shows how it works. At the beginning, or quite a while back prior to 1943, it was called childhood schizophrenia. It has some features that are somewhat like schizophrenia, but Leo Kanner was the one who broke it out and realized that it was separate from schizophrenia and introduced the word autism. And one of the main characteristics or differences is the fact that autism occurs much earlier in development. As you probably know, schizophrenia tends to emerge in early adulthood. And so then into the 90s, we broke out into these three categories. The sort of classic autism that would have the more severe forms of it, pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified. I never really quite knew what that meant. And then Asperger's, which is the more mild form that you are aware of. And then in the 5th version of their manual, in 2013, these 3 were all collapsed into one, into autism spectrum disorder, which I think was a huge mistake, because there is a huge difference between these folks, and yet now they're all called autistic. It's a longer and different talk, but so we have, just to show how meaningless it is, and I apologize for showing this face to you at this point in history, but you have people who are college graduates and functioning well in society on one end of the spectrum, and then you have the very serious cases on the other end. And so you have the irony of the richest man in the world being able to say that he's autistic. This, by the way, is not really a true statement. Apparently, there was a previous Asperger's host. And also, I should point out that he apparently self-diagnosed. It's not like he went to a doctor. That's a whole other... There's several topics I could go off on, but I'm going to try to stay on the focus. So here are things, as an example of that, here are some things I've written about that are associated with the autism, problem or autism as a topic. I'm not going to talk about any of these, but if you want to read about them, you can. But they each have their issues that are challenges for skeptical thinking. Autism, especially the more severe form, and I will say that my talk today is completely about the more severe form of autism, the non-speaking individuals, has been called a fad magnet. And there are just so many fads that have been drawn to it. This is an incomplete list of some of the therapies that have been proposed for autism. I don't even know what half of these things are, but it comes from the Autism Science Foundation, which is a very good group. I want to mention just briefly that these are not benign treatments in many cases. Some of them are quite dangerous. And this one, it was recently in the news, sadly, because a boy just last month who was put in a hyperbaric chamber. You know, hyperbaric chamber is filled with pure oxygen. It's used, you know, with divers, to prevent the bends and so forth. He was put in this chamber, and because of all the oxygen in the chamber, it exploded and he died. I've read several news items about this case. It does not say that he was being treated for autism in any of the news items, but the agency where he went, the clinic that he went to, advertises that hyperbaric chambers can be used for autism there, and as well as a bunch of other things. So. Absolutely no evidence that it does any good at all, and obviously quite dangerous. Okay, so this is the main topic of the talk. I'm going to do a little preparatory work before we get to them, but there are 3 stories that have come out, very dramatic stories, in less than a year, starting last summer. So the idea that there is no pseudoscience in the modern world of autism is obviously not true, as I will demonstrate. All 3 of these stories involve discredited forms of communication for people with autism who have serious language deficits. The one on the left, pictured here, is the age-old, and started in the 90s in the U.S., facilitated communication, and what you have is a mother, in this case, assisting her son as they both type together on a keyboard. And this is the newer version of it, and I will explain both a little more as we go along, that involves a letter board. There's no direct touching of the individual, but the letter board, for reasons that are not clear, is held in the air and is not stable. So we still have a problem. The basic issue is that in both cases, there are 2 people involved in the communication, which muddies the water with respect to who's actually communicating. Okay, so briefly, and I apologize because I know that there are many people who are very familiar with this already, but for those who aren't, the theory is that these non-speaking individuals have intact minds, but they have broken bodies. They have normal, or even in some cases above typical functioning cognitively, but they cannot get their thoughts out. And so they need to be supported by someone else to help type. It's interesting that most of the messages you hear coming out of these typewriters are political. No one understands me, right? Very few of them are like, I would like a Diet Coke, or anything like that. There's also, and more importantly, there's no explanation for the sudden literacy that this involves. You and I, when we learn to type or to write, we first learned to speak, right? And all of that was an interesting process. And then we learned to somehow map letters onto those words and so forth. These individuals never went through that process, and somehow they have learned, emerge suddenly with very sophisticated speech. And then the other really obvious problem, if you can see in this picture, is that often the non-speaking individual isn't even looking at the keyboard. You notice that the mother in this case is looking intently at the board as she holds her daughter's hand, whereas the daughter is often looking away. I have other examples of this I'll show you later. But, and I have a little video now. Let's hope it works.
It's certainly true that a touch typist can type without looking at the keyboard. Connie Cesari, star graduate of the Catherine Gibbs School, can type 100 words a minute without looking. She has memorized the layout of the keys. But before starting, she registers her hands in a home position. This is her reference. Frontline wanted to see if she could type with one finger without looking. Despite her intimate knowledge of the keyboard, she can't. Nobody can. Without a reference, it's just impossible.
You can't be a one-fingered typist and not look at the keyboard. You just can't get oriented. You don't have...
Okay, so this is Howard Shane. He will show up later in the story. This is Howard Shane, by the way, in the 1990s. You're going to see him, the modern version, later on in the talk. So back in the 90s when this was first introduced, facilitated communication, the old-fashioned version, for various reasons, it became clear that there needed to be testing to determine who is the author of these communications. And I apologize for the quality of this image, but the setup was very simple: a divider so that the non-speaking person could see a picture here, and the facilitator could see a picture here, but neither could see the other person's picture. And so on some trials, and these are very simple identifications that given that before this time the person was writing essays and poetry, being able to identify a shoe or a cup should have been very easy to do. And what they found was that when both pictures were the same, the correct answer was provided. But if the two pictures were different, what was typed out was what the facilitator saw, not what the non-speaking person saw, on every single trial. So it was very obvious that the control was coming from the facilitators and it was undoubtedly unconscious in I would imagine, in almost every case. But it was, in fact, coming from the facilitator. The scientific explanation for how this happens has a couple of features to it. One is that it is an Ouija board-like process. Those of us who have played the Ouija board know how that works. You don't tend to play it alone, right? You play it with two or more people on the planchette, the pointing device. And once there are two people involved, this is a nice Norman Rockwell illustration. Once there are two people involved, it breaks down the cause and effect relationship. We're not sure who's doing it, right? And people say, I'm not moving it, you must be moving it, right? That whole thing. And so that's one explanation, the breakdown of who's who. The other is something called the ideomotor effect, which is a very old-fashioned thing that has been studied in the laboratory. And the idea is that simply an idea can unconsciously get someone to move in a certain direction. So, for example, oops. Yes, it was. I didn't have this as an idea, but anyway, I'll let that go. Low tech. So the idea is that if I had a planchette, if your hand was on a planchette and you couldn't see it, and I asked you to think about the lobby, right? Your hand might unconsciously move in the direction of the lobby. And so that's the ideomotor effect, that unconscious movements that happen simply by suggestion, by an idea. And if you're really interested in this whole topic, I strongly recommend, I'm going to recommend several books before we're done today. This one called The Illusion of Conscious Will, controversial title, admittedly. But it's a great book, and he did a lot of the research on how people could do facilitated communication and not know that they were doing it as part of this book. So when the research was done, part of it was stimulated by false claims of sexual abuse. You know, the child would supposedly type out, "Daddy is doing X, Y, and Z to me," on the board, and families were separated, court cases resulted, and so it became very important to test to determine who really was communicating in these things. And then in every case where this was being used, the tests revealed that it wasn't the child saying it at all, and the cases eventually were dropped, but they were still very, very disruptive for those families. And so then came this documentary Prisoners of Silence. That's what the clip that I just showed you about the Catherine Gibbs typist. And that was very devastating for facilitated communication, but this was back in the 90s. And so it did sort of go into a phase of being somewhat discredited. And finally, and very importantly, it's now up to, I think, over 30 professional organizations and advocacy organizations that have policy statements against the use of facilitated communication. So the ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the American Psychological Association, American Pediatric Association, something called ABAI, do you guys know what that is? Also has a statement about it. So anyway, we thought it was done, right? We thought, well, okay, we can now go on and think about other things, right? No, it never went away. It offers too much of a prize for parents for it to go away. And furthermore, it now has a new form that is taking off like wildfire. Fire. So it involves a letterboard. This is the same picture you saw before, a letterboard or a stencil, and held in the air by a communication partner, often a parent, but sometimes a teacher. And the child just has their finger out or sometimes uses a pencil, if it's a stencil, and points. But the letterboard is floating in the air and is brought up, by the parent or the communication partner, and the communication partner also calls out the letters as they are typed, right? Because the child can't, and so this. This causes the same sort of questions. We still have the same questions about who is actually communicating in this circumstance. It goes by the name rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate. And as I say here, no one has ever provided an adequate explanation as to why the letterboard can't just be put on the table or put on an easel and the communication partner can walk away and it can be done independently. There's just, they don't really explain that part. Okay, that's the background. Here are the 3 stories in less than a year. The first is a documentary that appeared on Netflix. Did anyone see this? Oh, okay. Well, you can see it if you want. Unfortunately, I am going to spoil it for you. But it's about a famous case that you may have heard about. This is called Tell Them That You Love Me. And as you can see, it involves the classic old-fashioned form of facilitated communication. I don't think anybody actually uses 2 hands that I'm aware of, but you can see it's hand over hand. And it involves the case of Anna Stubblefield, who was a philosophy professor at Rutgers University in Newark. And she taught disability studies. She appears in the documentary and appears to be a very sweet, person, very nice person. She taught disability studies at Rutgers. She was an FC believer, as was her mother, actually. And she met a family of a young man with severe cerebral palsy, and she began using facilitated communication with him. And this is a man who has almost, I think, no language at all, is now in his 30s, still wears a diaper, and cannot walk except with assistance from someone else. And so he's severely disabled. And she began working with him, and the family sort of went along with it and thought this might be a positive thing. And then at some point she comes to the house with the young man's mother, brother at the kitchen table, and the man himself. His name was Derek. Derek Johnson is the man with cerebral palsy. And she says to the family, "We are in love, and not only that, we have made love." So she claimed that he had actually seduced her through facilitated communication, and of course that they had both consented to sex, and that they had had sex. And this did not go over well with the family, as you can imagine. It started back in 2011. She was tried for some level of sexual abuse and was convicted, served a couple of years in jail. She then appealed her case and was able to get an order for a retrial based on evidence that wasn't allowed in the first case, evidence that shouldn't have been allowed in my view. The prosecutors were prepared to try her again, and she accepted a plea deal confessing to pleading guilty to a lesser form of sexual abuse, and she was released on time served, on probation and so forth. So here she is at home now after that's all over. So anyway, I think that I would recommend you watch it. I think that the general effect of this documentary is a good one, because although it starts out sounding, fairly benign, by the time you get to the end, there's a fairly serious ick factor. People are revolted by when they discover what went on. And so it does show, I think, the harms of this technique. I do, however, think that the presentation of facilitated communication is still too balanced. There's always this desire to balance things, but like some things shouldn't be balanced, right? They're just wrong. And so that's just my personal view. Howard Shane was an expert witness in that trial, and he also is in the documentary. So I was invited to write this piece on a Substack called Reality's Last Stand by a guy named Colin Wright. Some of you may have heard of. And so I wrote this piece, and I decided I would interview Howard. I know him a little bit, and I was like driving down to see riding on the train down to see my son in Washington, D.C., and he was driving in his car from Boston, where he works, to his house in New Hampshire. So we had a nice long conversation. I'm standing in between cars of the train so I don't bother people. And he said, after I got some quotes from him and some thoughts on this documentary, he said, you really should talk to this guy, Kevin Plantan. And so I said, who is he? And he told me it was a false case of sexual abuse, like the old ones, that had not been publicized yet. And so he put me in touch with Kevin, and that led to story number 2. And so Kevin Plantan, and I want to say that Janice Boynton is a former facilitator who I know quite well, and she was first asked to give this talk and couldn't do it, so I'm the lucky second in line. But she also knew Kevin Plantan. He had contacted her. And so between Howard and Janice, and also the random fact that I was from Connecticut and Kevin was from Connecticut, I gained his trust. And so he was willing to tell me his story, and I was placed in the situation where I could break his story for the first time. And the story goes like this. He's a divorced father. His daughter has severe autism. He was living in Florida, but was making monthly visits up to Virginia, where they lived. And one day during COVID time in 2021, January, he arrived at a public park where he was supposed to meet his daughter and his daughter's mother for a visit, but instead a policeman showed up and arrested him. And it was because the daughter had been using facilitated communication with the mother and had made a charge of rape 3 or 6 years earlier, many years earlier, that he was accused of rape. And he had gone along with the facilitated communication. He knew about it. He thought it was exciting. He had never done it with his daughter at all. But the minute he heard what he was being charged with and how the communication was done, he knew, something's wrong here. This is because I am not guilty. But nonetheless, he was put in jail, and he spent 10 months. This is the longest case that we know of a person being jailed for a false charge of sexual abuse. And so he was completely naive to the backstory of facilitated communication. And eventually what happened was that friends were in court, and the daughter was at one point brought into court and made to communicate with facilitated communication and sort of repeat the claims. And people in the courtroom said, "Uh-oh, I know what this is," you know. And so he finally got an attorney who had worked with cases like this before. Howard Shane was again brought in. That's how I got connected to it. And then a funny twist. The mother, first of all, the judge heard a presentation from Howard Shane about facilitated communication and immediately ordered testing to determine who was doing the communication and asked Howard Shane to do the testing, which he agreed. So eventually what happened was, as the testing drew near, the mother's divorce attorney, now this is a criminal proceeding, but the mother's divorce attorney offered a deal that if Kevin would give up his parental rights and never see his daughter again, she would drop the case. And of course, it wasn't her case to drop. This was being done by a prosecutor, but I interviewed the prosecutor and said, "Is this true that this happened?" She said, "Yes, it did happen." And she said, "Look, if the mother had not cooperated, I couldn't have gone on with the case." So the mother really did have the power to do that. But when the judge heard the story, he immediately set Kevin free, gave him bond, let him out of jail. He knew that he was being manipulated, and he was quite angry. And so he got out, finally, after 10 months. But the charges were still over his head, and the testing hadn't been done yet. As the time for the testing approached, the mother finally, as happens in many of these cases, the mother refused to do the testing, and the prosecutor was required to drop the charges. But it took 11 months out of his life. He lost his job. You know, he lost basically his career, and he's, you know, in very difficult circumstances. When I interviewed him for this story, he was living with a relative and working at a telemarketing job, you know, which paid much less than what he had normally had, and he had lots of debts and so forth. He has gone on the offensive since my story. I mean, I felt very fortunate to break the story, to be the first one to tell it, and it got quite a bit of coverage. He now has gone on a number of podcasts, including the Amanda Knox podcast. Some of you may know who Amanda Knox is, and so I hope he can, you know, get some satisfaction out of this. Unfortunately, his daughter is still using facilitated communication for reasons I can explain later, and he is still barred from contact with his daughter, not because another judge, the family court judge for his case, the local one, believes in facilitated communication despite all of this, and he will not let him have contact. So his life really has been just shattered by pseudoscience completely. It's a sad thing. And so, although this is an old story, you know, these cases of sexual abuse allegations began back in the 90s. They have never really gone away. Here are 3 others that are not too long ago in the past, and so they keep cropping up. And in every case, you know, ultimately, either the parent refuses to do the testing, or the testing shows that it's bogus. And so that's the problem. Okay, story number 3, the wildest one of all, has just happened. How many people have heard of the Telepathy Tapes or listened to them? Okay, good. So I woke up on January 1st to discover that the Telepathy Tapes podcast was number 1 on Spotify and on iTunes. It had eclipsed the enormously popular Joe Rogan Experience, in part because Joe Rogan, I think, spoke about the show positively on his show. And I thought, like, my life's work has been for nothing, you know. Like, the world is full of, you know, stuff. So anyway, the claims of this show are that not only do non-speaking people with autism have the ability to speak or to communicate articulately with FC or with the spelling techniques now. That's what they call the letterboard techniques. They call them spelling. But they also have psychic abilities. They can read their parents' minds. They can communicate telepathically with each other over long distances. They can insert thoughts into into other people even when they didn't want them. And there's this concept of the hill, which is they claim that over long distances, autistic children primarily meet up psychically and have like a chat room conversation at various points. And so it's quite out there. And this is just a few of the claims. There's going to be a second season, and it's supposed to get even more intense. I think they have psychic healing. There's all sorts of stuff. There's also a religious aspect to it. There's a lot of mention of angels and things like that. So anyway, now I'm going to show you some clips. This is a podcast, right? So most of as you listen to it, you're only hearing descriptions. And I have to say from the outset that the people who are the producer of this thing, Kai Dickens, totally in the tank for all these methods. She is just it's a crusade for her. In fact, she explicitly says that the real purpose of the podcast is to promote the spelling techniques, is the discredited. And so here we're going to see a psychic test. Now you'll notice that she has this intimidating copyright telepathy tape. So I'm taking a little bit of a risk here that I hope I'm not, this is what we call fair use. I think this is meant to keep people from doing what I'm about to do right now. I downloaded, what? I'm a lawyer, you're fine. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I may call you later. So anyway, I downloaded these from their website. It's a podcast, so you can't see it normally. And there's sometimes no mention of the actual communication method at all. It's very pleasant. There's a lot of music, and it's breathless description. But on the website, there are some clips that she provided, because the real goal is to make a documentary film, right, that she hopes will promote all of this stuff. And they're beginning to make quite a bit of money, and I understand they dropped a new episode this morning, which I listened to, and so that you wouldn't have to. And they said that they're about to start production next month. So here's a psychic test that they do, and I want to point out that the woman in the background is one of their experts. She's described as a scientist. She's not a scientist. She is a psychiatrist. She did study some neuroscience as part of her training, but she's a psychiatrist, and her curriculum vitae is not on the web anywhere. And I found absolutely no published, peer-reviewed empirical articles by her in the world ever. But she's the scientist. So you're going to see some science here, and I hope you're impressed. So what we have here, she's going to hold up an Uno card with a number on it. And you can see the mother is holding the stencil, and the young man is poised with the pencil. And so what's important to note, I'll just play it in a minute, but what's important to note is that the mother knows the answer, right? The mother is looking at the Uno card and then does this, right? So if the mother's communicating the answer, then it's not psychic, it's transcription, right? It's just, she's just expressing what she already knows. So anyway, you watch and you see if you are convinced by it. Psychic. So you couldn't hear very well there, but he actually has some language ability. He says the number after he pokes it. So that's kind of interesting that they're, rather than trying to capitalize on that with more traditional instruction, they're using this. It could be telepathy, but we don't know, because she's involved in that communication, and they've been doing this for a long time, so whatever cueing is going on could be quite subtle. It's interesting. So here is another example. This one actually does not involve the spelling technique. This is a popsicle stick sorting project. And by the way, the only real skeptic that's that's mentioned in the podcast is the cinematographer, who's described as being a real skeptic, and he doesn't believe anything, you know. Well, this popsicle stick thing apparently, you know, just blew him away, and he's now a true believer. And I find that amusing because it's ridiculous. But let me just, I'm going to start it and then stop it so that I can talk about it for a second. You can ignore this. Okay, here we go. So, first of all, I have to say this. Talk about controlled science, right? We are in someone's living room, right? I don't know whether it's the family or what. This is our scientist here, Diane. Her name is Diane Hennessy Powell, and she's talking as this is going. Here's someone's dog, right? Like, of course you have a dog in the lab, right? That's a very controlled environment. And so the task here is that the daughter is blindfolded, the mother is not. There are 4 different colored popsicle sticks there. And so the job of the daughter is she's going to be handed one of these popsicle sticks while blindfolded. And her job is to move horizontally and then drop the popsicle stick in the right pile, right? That's all, just that. But do you notice anything unusual? What's this, right? The mother's hand is on the child's head. And as you watch the video, I mean, I don't know what you see, but what I see is the mother is moving that head almost like it was a joystick. To prompt the child in the various direction. And so it's kind of interesting. There is one case in which it's supposed to be yellow. There's a lot of hesitation. And I think it looks like the mother's about to yank her daughter's head off. But anyway, I don't want to bias your view of it.
Of course not.
The 3-camera setup thing is supposed to be very scientific, too. See the head move over?
What's the rationale for the mother holding the daughter's blindfolded?
I mean, this is the thing. That question that you asked, never asked in the podcast. And you know, no one, see, here's the hesitation, right? But look at the head. I mean, like, literally, oh, my neck. And it still isn't going the right spot. So then eventually it gets over there. Yeah. So I think there's one more. Yeah, now the head's back. It's science. What do you mean? One more. They do one more. So, okay, so that's it. Yay, very good. So no one asked the question, can she do it without your hand on there, right? I mean, it's just, I'm amazed at how bad this is. So anyway, these are the only 2 real clips that I have from the show, but there are lots of others. And I really look forward to the documentary because unless they have crazy camera angles or something, it's going to make it obvious that there are issues. So first of all, I want to say, unfortunately, as fun as that was, this is not a great thing. This is a very bad circumstance. It is, I think, going to do a tremendous damage. It is really promoting these spelling techniques a lot. People who had never heard of them before are now hearing about them for the first time. And so for us, it's a great setback, and it's too bad. The one thing I would say is that there have been a lot of articles written. I wrote about it immediately, when it came out, and there have been a number of podcasts and other articles that have been critical of it. So it's not getting through, easily in some regard. But I think in general, it's a setback. Some people have asked me. A reporter once asked me, "Well, what's the harm? There seems to be something positive going on between these parents and these kids. What's the harm?" And so I want to show you this last video, and I hope the audio will come out for this. But this is a young man and a father. They obviously love each other, but the father is using a combination of facilitated communication and the letterboard technique, because he is holding both the letterboard and his son's arm. So the son is really completely, ancillary to the whole thing. He could do he's a marionette. He could do the same thing with a doll, and it would be the same performance. And you'll notice that the son is almost never looking into it. He would have to be psychic for this to work, because he's almost never looking at the board. That's it. So, the father is doing everything, including calling out the letters, and the boy is just there. I mean, I may be imposing my own judgment on this, but I feel as though this young man's human rights are being violated, that he is not being, he is not being loved for who he really is. He is instead being turned into a fantasy for his parents. And for many of these parents, they've been doing this with their kids for hours and hours for years. And so the opportunity cost, the actual instruction that could have gone on with them is I think, a serious loss. One of the aspects that has also been damaging for those who are in favor of science and reason is the effect of the pandemic. Many of the school systems do not support FC, thankfully. For the most part, there are actual speech-language therapists in the schools. They know about the ASHA statement against the use of this technique. And so the school systems do not support it and do not allow it for the most part. But what the solution has been, especially since the pandemic, that many of these parents are schooling their kids at home, where the supervision is low and they can get away with doing this. That's exactly what happened in Kevin Plantan's case. His mother brought his daughter home and hired occupational therapists to come into the house and use facilitated communication with her at home, and insisted that she be instructed by the school department at grade level, right, at actual grade level, rather than in a level that would have been more appropriate for her. And she suddenly was like the best student in the class. But the teacher, but her IEP report said these grades should be taken with a grain of salt, because they're using facilitated communication at home, and not only that, they rarely see the girl on the screen during class time. But that's a real problem, is that parents have taken their children into the home for instruction are using these techniques. And of course, the pandemic also, unfortunately, bred a whole new crop of people who are skeptical of science. The politics of all of this is very familiar to all of us. And so another book I recommend, if you haven't read it, is Tom Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise, in which he talks about how now it's so common to do your own research and not trust experts. So that has been a problem. Given this, I'm going to try to end on a positive note with a few things. So here we go. First of all, spread the facts, right? This is a website that I and a group of people, Janice Boynton is one of them, put up ourselves. We do it at our own expense as a volunteer effort. We were able to get the actual URL, facilitatedcommunication.org. And so when people Google, this site has lots of factual information about it. There's a whole list of all of the false claims of sexual abuse on it and the other court cases like ones I talked about today. And it's been very valuable because there is an email thing so that people can contact us. And and Janice talks to them usually when they contact us. And often it's people who are new to this and are coming into contact with facilitated communication for the first time. And those are the people that are really can be changed, can be steered in the right direction. Once a family or a person is really committed to this, it's very hard to change their minds, as you can imagine. It's just too good to challenge. So if you get a chance, if you got a syllabus, you can put that URL on, do it. The other thing is that people with profound, severe and profound autism do have real needs. And unfortunately, the facilitated communication is a huge distraction from the real needs that those people have, and is very damaging. So there is a new organization called the National Council on Severe Autism, and as you can see, they are saying that the American Psychiatric Association should eschew the mythical unity of the autism spectrum disorder. So they want a dedicated diagnosis for the old classic autism. They will accept autistic disorder, severe autism, profound autism, or classic autism. They don't care, as long as they get back to a diagnosis that doesn't include Elon Musk in the category. Not that it's nothing personal against him, but so anyway, so this is a great organization. One of the people who founded it is Amy Lutz, who, and this is my last book recommendation in the end of the talk. Amy Lutz is the mother of a young man with serious, profound autism, but she also does not believe that he's psychic or that he has, the ability to write novels. And she is part of the effort of the organization, the Severe Autism Organization I mentioned before. And she also recently published this book called Chasing the Intact Mind. So if anybody has an interest in this topic, I really recommend it. She talks about the various ways over the years that autism has been conceptualized in the popular press as well as professionally. She has a chapter on facilitated communication, but she also has chapters on topics that are of great concern for parents of children with these severe forms of autism. If you have a child of this kind, you know from the beginning that they're going to need supervision for their entire lives. And the facilities for that are not available where they should be. So she's working on that, and I highly recommend the book. And I think I'm finished.
Okay. Actually, I'll run around and get questions for a second, but I have to say, because our Center for Inquiry Investigations group, Stuart was at the meeting yesterday, based out of this building, has tested more telepaths than anyone in the world for the last 2 decades. And we looked at some of these test protocols for these people and were like screaming at the videos. Horribly designed, as Stuart well pointed out, but even beyond what he was pointing out, there's reflections in cameras and people allowed to wear glasses and all kinds of things that just would never pass muster in a well-designed test of telepathy. So, sorry, I had to say that.
Yes, and I should also mention that you know, as most people in this room know, CFI has a $500,000 challenge for anybody who can demonstrate paranormal or psychic ability in a controlled setting. When I saw this podcast, I immediately wrote to the producers and said, hey, you guys might want to try this. It's $500,000 and you've got all this going on. And I also wrote that in the art. I reported about that in my article about it. And Jim, as of this moment, no contact from them. Is that
no
correct?
contact. Although I will say that we did contact Kai Dickens, the woman who produced the Telepathy Tapes podcast, and offered our services to better design some of these tests. She wrote back thanking us and saying that they weren't meant to be scientifically designed tests. And we said, well, we knew that. But anyway, so I don't know if it was a sincere offer, but from her to keep us in the loop. But we will certainly be happy to consult on any further testing of them.
Yeah.
So,
Great.
Okay, so questions. Yeah, let's do it in the mic. This is being recorded, by the way.
Oh my, you didn't tell me.
I'm a special ed teacher in Orange County, and we have a student who is in 3rd grade, nonverbal, whose parents are insisting on FC. And apparently there was a court case that said parents are allowed to choose the mode of communication for their student. And so we cannot use picture icons. We cannot use PECs. We cannot, because the parents are demanding FC instead. Are you aware of a court case?
No. So has that become policy then in California, or?
I just know of this one student whose parent wants to train us on FC, and the SLPs are saying here's what we know, and we're not doing this with your child.
Right.
But they're not allowed to use other methods that are proven or are scientific, and because the parents aren't allowing it.
Yeah, I don't know about that specific case, but I mean it is the case in the United States, and you saw the skateboard fellow. We grant parents wide control over how their children are educated. I mean, this whole business about homeschooling versus in school is part of that. And so it's a challenge if the parents have bought into this technique. Most of the court cases, there have been several court cases, and some of my colleagues in this cabal, by the way, Hank Schlinger in the front row is part of this sort of loose cabal of people who are working against FC. But some of them, there have been a number of court cases in which parents have tried to get the school system to pay for facilitators and allow it in the schools. And most of those have failed so far. There's one ongoing now that in Pennsylvania that a colleague of mine is testifying in. But that's a real challenge. I mean, I have heard many people at conferences say, I have a parent who's using this method. I can't do it, but it's a problem. Do you have any advice for me? And unfortunately, I don't. I mean, it's a tough thing. So I'm sorry to hear about that. That's unfortunate.
Would you recommend them watching the Frontline episode?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they probably have
Really?
seen it.
I don't know how you get through that and
It
still
didn't impress them,
stay behind FC.
Yeah. Thankfully, the Frontline episode is now on the Internet Archive in perpetuity. You can watch it for free. So, everyone should watch it.
Yeah, pretty much blows it out of the water.
Hank.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just want to point out. I want to point out that and you mentioned this. When somebody comes along and promises that your kid who's never spoken now can tell you that they love you, and no quality documentary like Frontline or any kind of scientific evidence or any scientific reasonable argument is going to trump that.
Yeah,
And
it's just too much. That is the main factor.
yeah, and also it's part of a quick fix society. I mean, ABA therapy is obviously very effective for most kids diagnosed with autism, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes weeks, months, years.
Yeah,
And here's a technique that not only promises that your kid can communicate with you who never has and can tell you they love you, but it'll happen instantly.
Yeah,
And then of course, then it's easy to buy into the whole notion that they've always been that way and that their body prevents them from being able to, and now you have, and so, scientific reason and evidence is just, it's not going to work with a lot of those people.
That's true. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry, it wasn't a question.
Yeah, you go from, these parents go from having a kid with a horrible disorder to having a kid in the telepathy tapes with a magical ability. It's hard to just logic your way out of that.
You would seem FC is facilitated ventriloquism.
Yes.
That's really all it is. My question, the advantage of the change in diagnosis to spectrum disorder was to get away from the use of Asperger term. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand what I think it was Wing, was it sort of Lorna Wing, I think it was the one who was the main force behind making a spectrum. And I'm sure there were some positive aspects or well-meaning motivation for that. But I don't know what's necessarily bad about the Asperger's diagnosis. There maybe have been some disadvantage to it. But in fact, the real problem is that there are lots of verbal people who call themselves autistic who have chosen to speak for the autistic population because they can, and the nonverbal people are being their needs are being completely overwhelmed, and it's a very political situation.
The objection to the use of Asperger has to do with his Nazi affiliation. That's the issue.
But there's no reason why that couldn't be some other name given to it. I understand that. So, okay.
I didn't understand the slide with Amanda Knox. Could you explain more about why?
Yeah.
Is she involved with this, or what she's doing now, or why you use that?
I used it because Kevin Plantan, the man who was who was locked up for 10 months, had not gone public with his story until he allowed me to write about it. And he needs help. He wants to be able to get his child away from FC, and he wants to have access to her again. So he has taken a public campaign, and she read my story and invited him on. It's just simply to get more publication, and the fact that he has gone on the offensive for himself, which I thought was a positive development. So that's all. Part of her podcast. Yes, she did an episode on him.
Yeah.
A little slightly off topic, but is the incidence of autism actually changing?
I mean, I'm not probably the best expert to answer that. There is the question of additional diagnosis. I think that there was some recent harder data that suggested that it is actually going up. But because of the spectrum, it is sort of unclear, because first of all, you do have people self-diagnosing, right? There's a huge movement to go on TikTok and talk, hear someone talk about what it's like to be autistic, and to diagnose yourself. In fact, that's gone mainstream. There's the CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Is that right? On their website now, could you be autistic? It says. And then it has a thing, the pros and cons of traditional diagnosis or self-diagnosis. And they're put on equal status, as if that's, it's up to you. You can diagnose yourself or you can come in and we'll do it, And so I think there's a lot of issues involved in getting accurate numbers. But my understanding is that with respect to the severe forms of autism, there's some new data that suggests it is increasing. I'm not, Hank, do you have any better?
No, I don't. I don't, but I know that it went from 4 or 5 out of 10,000 when we were working with kids diagnosed with autism. And most of the kids that I worked with, and I'm assuming you too, were profoundly autistic.
Yeah.
So it went from an incidence of 4 or 5 out of 10,000 to now it's 1 in 30.
Wow.
In a period of 30 years or 40 years or something.
Yeah.
Just because of the change in the designation.
Well, I would say, the change in the designation and also the self-diagnosis probably too. And I also want to point out that. More funding. Yes. Yeah, when you're diagnosed, then you're eligible for funding.
Right.
And services, which have to be supported financially. Right. And also, it is a fad magnet, but it's also, you get a lot of attention if you tell people you're autistic.
Now, yes.
Yes, now, of course.
It's become a social thing.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. So.
Yeah.
For those of you who are super CFI trivia experts, you might have recognized, no one recognized her, but Diane Hennessy Powell, the scientist involved in this, was next to me in a taping of the Dr. Phil show where I was the only one criticizing a set of psychics that were on stage, and she was also brought in right next to me to try to lend some scientific support to the world of psychic ability. So she's and she's had her medical license revoked.
She did briefly, I think, and she claimed that it was because she was so out there and had these, revolutionary ideas. But I think it was more mundane than that. It was some kind of record-keeping problems and so on. I don't know. But anyway, I think she was able to get it back at some point.
Okay.
But the thing that's really true is that she's not a scientist at all. And furthermore, she's written a book on ESP. She's a total believer. And she also was a colleague of, what's his name, the alien abduction guy?
Oh, Mac.
Yeah. They were colleagues together.
At Harvard.
They were in the same department at Harvard. The guy who believed in, that people had been abducted by aliens. And so, she's clearly very skeptical.
Yeah.
Hard. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you.
We appreciate all your work. Keep up the good work on this because we need credible people to go against some of this stuff. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for our great volunteers, Dave and Gretchen. Alice helped out today, and Sean on tech. Next month, we have an excellent talk. In fact, our professor of film is here today watching this episode. But we'll be talking about ambiguity and deception in film, and it nicely bridges the Hollywood world and how it addresses this question of, is something true or not? So a month from today, check that out. And on March 7th and 8th is something called Skepticamp, which is open and free to the public. And that's going to happen in this room. It's like an all-day thing where people come up, local skeptics come up and do short presentations on a variety of different topics. So we invite you to that. It'll be an interesting day full of stuff. Where do they find out information about Skepticamp?
You can go to Skepticamp with one C, SKEPTICAMPLA.com.
Skepticamp.com, la.com. So yeah, check that out. Thanks for coming, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.